Yeah. Yeah. Welcome to the Into the Wilderness podcast. I am your host, Byron Pace. It is the 9th of July, 2020, and my interview today is with Catherine E. Semcer, a research fellow at the Property and Environment Research Centre. Most of her work there focuses on rights and market-based solutions to policy challenges in environmental security, conservation finance, and sustainability. This really is a deep dive into the cogs which make conservation work. And by cogs, I mean, how do we fund conservation? We look at the interplay between private and public land ownership, how these models work, and the complexities of migration corridors cutting through different land uses, an issue that we are also dealing with in deer management right now in the UK. We go on to discuss incentivizing conservation in the public good and how important knowledge exchange is between countries. Towards the middle of the show, we dig into the global wildlife trade and what we mean by that, and how harnessing regulated trade can help address social inequality and help prevent viral spillovers into humans. We touch on carbon credits, clean water initiatives, and the consequences of potential new regulations on wildlife products in California. One point of extra information for the show that I need to just add here is that I asked Catherine about funding mechanisms for the economic shortfall in national parks and publicly owned land in the US. She talks at length about solutions in the show, but our conversation occurred before the Senate passed the Great American Outdoors Act, which would establish permanent funding of $900 million a year for the Land and Water Fund and create a National Parks and Public Lands Legacy Fund directing up to $9.5 billion over 5 years to address priority repairs in national parks and other public lands. This act has yet to be enacted, and more information can be found on the Theodore Roosevelt Conservation Partnership website. 2 weeks ago, I asked you all to tag me in a post somewhere on social media or send me an email and show me how are you listening to this show. A heap of you did that, and a winner picked at random was chosen. Ben Greaves tagged me in a picture of his sink, washing his dishes. A fine way to consume the podcast. So well done, Ben. Contact me, podcast@paceproductionsuk.com, and I will send you out a copy of Modern Huntsman. Of course, Modern Huntsman are our partners on the podcast, helping make it possible for me to interview interesting and smart people around complicated and crucial topics. You can read more about the team and the publication at www.modernhuntsman.com, where Volume 5, the Traditions issue, is now shipping. They should be landing in the UK next week with any luck, and we'll be able to get those rest of world orders out. For this week, to win a volume of Modern Huntsman of your choosing, simply comment in one of the posts when this show goes out. Tell me what your favourite episode has been so far. On Twitter and Instagram, find the show at Byron J. Pace, and on Facebook, podcast Into the Wilderness. Or you can send an email, podcast@paceproductionsuk.com. Sometimes I forget to mention, but if you're a podcast listener, you can get 15% off any Modern Huntsman products on our shop. Visit thepacebrothers.com and use the promo code Into the Wilderness. Last thing before we jump into the show, a massive shout out, of course, to our top tier patrons, which include this week Richard Stevens, Richard McNeil, Ronnie Speakman of rdcontracting.co.uk, Tom McCraith, James Benjamin Normandale, James Marchington, the team at South Esh Stalking, Josh Starling, Sean Rowan, James Albin Corbin, Thomas Cameron, and Mark Zabrowski. If you want to help support the show, head over to patreon.com/pacebrothers, and you can have a look at the various support tiers. There is some pretty cool swag that we also send out when you sign up. So with all of that said, I welcome Catherine Semcer to the podcast. Catherine, welcome to the Into the Wilderness podcast. Thank you very much for joining me today. Where are you calling in from? What part of the world?
Well, today I'm in Washington, D.C., which is where I consider to be home.
We're gonna dive into a lot of topics today. Probably the most pertinent to the current conversation is wildlife trade and its role within the current pandemic and what the future looks like for the wildlife trade. But I think as a way of building a framework for the discussion, I'd be interested to know a little bit about your background and how you got to the position that you're in now, working with PERC, the Property and Environment Research Center. Because am I right in thinking you're actually an economist?
I am actually not an economist.
You're not.
My background, I'm not. No, my background is principally in policy. My career began a long, long time ago in the New York City office of McKinsey and Company. And from there, I moved to work in policy in Washington, D.C. for a large U.S. non-governmental organization. And what I did with them was work primarily with our Department of Defense to troubleshoot environmental problems as they impacted national security, particularly the training and readiness of U.S. troops. And I did that for over a decade, and then went off and formed my own consultancy. And as a consultant, one of my primary clients was another NGO that provided support services to counter poaching programs in Africa. And it was from that work that I eventually came to become a researcher with the Property and Environment Research Center in Bozeman, Montana, as well as the African Wildlife Economy Institute at Stellenbosch University in Stellenbosch, South Africa.
Okay, yes. I think what I was getting mixed up with is I know that there's a lot of economic drivers behind the conversations being had within PERC. So maybe that's why I thought that you had a background in economics. But I can see how what the work that you've been involved in is a perfect fit within the organization that you're now primarily working with. Tell me a little bit about them and their history, because I've been aware of them for a little while, but I would imagine quite a lot of listeners don't even know that they exist unless maybe you live in Bozeman, Montana. Even though the conversations that you have, you and your team, and what you publish is so much wider than what's happening in North America.
Absolutely. So PERC is the home of free market environmentalism. What PERC does is research ways that markets and property rights can be leveraged to solve environmental challenges. And the organization was founded in 1980 by a group of outdoor-oriented economists. So you're right when you hone in on the economic focus of PERC. But it's grown much larger than just traditional economics. In the 40 years that it's been in existence, we have research fellows who are experts in law. We have research fellows who are experts in policy, as well as research fellows who are experts in economics. And we each, research, within our lane, shall we say, how can property rights and markets be leveraged to solve environmental problems, be it wildlife trafficking, deforestation, water scarcity, how to fund national park maintenance. There's a whole host of issues that we currently have on our plate that our various research fellows are looking at.
It's interesting because my background's actually in economics. I worked in risk analytics in the city for some time before I moved into what I'm doing now, although I probably have largely forgotten most of it. But I do pick up things from time to time. I was reading an interesting paper not that long ago, written by two gents whose names I forget, but I'll put them in the notes for the show. And they wrote a paper on the property rights in Kenya just around the time that they banned hunting there. And when they were writing that, it was quite a new concept at the time, tying the role of conservation to the benefit that you get by having very defined property rights of land. We're going to get into that much more with our conversation, particularly in conservation in Africa. One thing that sprung to mind when I was reading this on the website was, in North America in particular, you have vast swathes of land which are publicly owned. And so the idea of property rights there are not on the individual, but a collective group or the government in trust for the people. So how do you rationalize that as a property right? Because that's something I've never quite got to grips with.
Well, I think one thing that's important to consider about the United States, as well, it is true that we have vast swaths of public land. Those lands are really confined to the western states. and the eastern portion of the country is dominated by private land. In fact, about 60% of the United States is in private ownership. And these private lands are critical to conservation in the United States. They provide more than half of the habitat for the species that are listed under our Endangered Species Act. They protect key wetlands. They protect migratory corridors for big game animals. One thing that we're looking at now is that we've got these tremendous big game migrations that occur in the western states. And the summer range of these mule deer, these elk, this other wildlife is typically found on the public estate that you mentioned. But the winter range and the migratory range, the transitional range, is very often found on the private lands that are interspersed in between the public lands. So, if we're going to have healthy public lands, we also need to have healthy private lands. And property rights are key to ensuring the health of those private lands because you care for what you own. As the old cliche goes, no one ever washes a rental car.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
It's the same when it comes to land ownership. So if you can strengthen the property rights that landowners have, you can find ways to give them an incentive to practice conservation, on their holdings, and that can have wide scale benefits for both the landowner and the general public.
There was a quote on the website which I pulled actually for this conversation with you, which is from a hero of mine, Aldo Leopold, a hero of many people's, and especially in conservation, where he stated that conservation will ultimately boil down to rewarding private landowners who conserve the public interest, which I think is a beautifully concise way of putting it.
Yeah, Leopold was quite the poet, and Leopold was definitely influenced by the private landowner. Primarily, having his work, in the Midwest in Sand County. He understood the value of the farmer, the rancher, the woodlot owner in helping the country to deliver conservation. But what PERC looks at is, well, what are the incentives to do that? How do you, make it attractive and, make wildlife, make wildlands, make, clean water an economic asset for the landowner so that they don't have an incentive to degrade the resource, as opposed to a liability, which can come sometimes with heavy-handed regulation and other approaches that are sometimes advocated for.
I mean, that is true around the world where there's a very simple logic that money and markets drive land use and how we use resources. And if the optimum land use in terms of economic return isn't one that favors conservation, then that is probably the land use that will be borne out in the long run. How can you give me a couple, maybe an example? Well, let's stick with North America for now, and then we're going to move on to Africa and trade, and take what you're telling us about North America into Africa. But how incentives can be put in place to make sure that the sort of the public good of land and land use comes to the fore rather than just maximizing economic return for the private landowner?
I think one place, where we see illustrated what you're, discussing is right in PERC's backyard. Just to the south of us, there's a place that's commonly known as the Paradise Valley. And
I know
this
it. Yeah.
This is a valley that is just to the north of Yellowstone National Park.
Beautiful place.
Incredibly beautiful place. It's bordered on one side by the Gallatin Mountain Range, on the other side by the Absarokas Mountains, and through the valley flows the Yellowstone River. And this valley is dominated by private lands. The mountainous areas, tend to be owned by the federal government, but that valley bottom is dominated by private lands. And it's this valley that the northern Yellowstone elk herd, which is one of the largest elk herds, in our part of the world, comes out of in the winter. They spend the summer in the highlands of Yellowstone National Park. If you've ever been to Mammoth Hot Springs, these are the elk that you see. And then as the temperatures start dropping, they start moving into the Paradise Valley. And that's, for a number of reasons, but a big reason is one, that's their historic migratory and winter range, but two, that the landowners there, provide pretty good forage and pretty good cover and pretty good habitat for these animals. But the presence of these animals, creates a cost for the landowners. Every acre of forage that these elk consume is less forage for their cattle. The elk, destroy fences, as they move across the landscape. Perhaps even more importantly, they bring with them the risk of a disease called brucellosis, which, if elk do transmit it to cattle, can cause cattle to abort, which also obviously has financial costs for landowners. So, one thing that we're looking at is how do we reduce or offset these costs that the elk impose on landowners, because particularly with these smallholder ranchers, you're working on such a narrow margin. Every little bit can help. And the more we can turn these elk into an economic asset, or at least make them economically neutral for the landowners, the less likelihood that these landowners are going to go out of business. Because what we've seen happen across the greater Yellowstone ecosystem is that when ranchers go out of business, more often than not, those ranch lands are subdivided, turned into smaller residential developments, and the habitat for those elk are lost. So, we're looking at everything from how do we leverage index insurance to offset the risk of disease transmission, with regard to brucellosis, to how do we create access to new markets, to premium markets, to increase the amount of cash that's going into a landowner's pocket. What are some of the other options that are out there to make it attractive to the landowner to want to have elk on their property because they're getting some type of premium payment or some other mechanism. And that's research that's still in progress, but it's something that we're going to be pursuing for the next several years.
Yeah, what springs to mind when you are telling me that story is leopards in Africa, which, generally speaking, are fairly heavily illegally persecuted by farmers because, in many instances, especially where hunting has been closed down, there is zero incentive to have a leopard on your farm. They're a negative asset to put a phrase around it, because they're doing nothing but take from you. Where hunting has been in place, there is a tolerance to accepting leopards living within the farm, because they know at some point, by selling the right to an external outfitter to hunt one or two leopards throughout the season, or whatever the permit system might be in that area, they're able to recoup economic loss, which is facilitated by leopards eating their cattle or sheep or livestock or whatever, and maybe even be able to make some money out of it. So hunting has been used in North America in similar ways to compensate. I suppose when it comes to elk, that must be something that's also being looked at.
It's been looked at by some states. So in the United States, wildlife is managed by each respective state. So we've essentially got 50 different wildlife management structures across our country. Some states have been very progressive in terms of incentivizing habitat conservation and land stewardship, wildlife stewardship on private lands by allowing landowners to tap into the large market that does exist for elk hunting in this country. Other states are still catching up, with what states like Colorado and New Mexico have done with allowing transferable tags and similar tools to take place. But I think it's a conversation that needs to occur between the hunting community and the landowner community, Because one thing that we've found in our research with landowners is while many of them do like the idea of having, say, transferable tags, it is a popular idea. There's also a cost that can come with that too, because once you start allowing people onto your property, then you have to manage that access. And that's fewer hours, in the day that you have to tend to your core business of raising cattle. So there's a balance that needs to be struck there. Allowing hunting is a great idea, and it's one that I'd love to see, more states adopt, through transferable tags. But the considerations that the landowners have in terms of like, okay, well now I'm going to allow people onto my land. What's that going to cost me? Have to be taken into consideration as well. And we're still sussing out, what are the details of that type of exchange.
Just to touch back on public lands for a moment before we go and talk about wildlife trade. I'm aware from spending a bit of time in the States the last couple of years and also had conversations with friends involved in various departments in different states that the public lands, largely speaking, across the board are heavily underfunded. What are the current conversations being had about how to fill that deficit that's there? I know the one mechanism that I am well aware of is comes through taxes on sporting goods for hunting and fishing, and those taxes going in to help fund conservation efforts in different states, along with the purchase of tags across over the counter for various different huntable species. I know that there were conversations in some states about this idea that other recreational users should pay to play, even if you're hill walking or mountain biking across the mountains. Do you know where that conversation has got to, or is it something that's still very much being fleshed out? I can imagine it's the kind of thing that there would be equal support for as well as resistance.
That's a great question, and this is a conversation, with regard to should we tax outdoor equipment, that's been going on for 20 plus years. So it's a conversation that's still in development. For your listeners who aren't aware, at present, um, a lot of state wildlife agencies, in fact, all of our state wildlife agencies, are funded through a mechanism whereby an excise tax is paid on firearms, ammunition, archery equipment, fishing tackle, and other outdoor equipment typically used by the sportsman's community. What we're talking about here, and this is a conversation that's happening between manufacturers, retailers, conservation organizations, agencies, is should that excise tax model be expanded to include backpacks, tents, mountain bikes, kayaks, etc. And some states, like Virginia, have moved in that direction already on their own. And I think, if I was going to look into my crystal ball, I think we're going to be having this conversation for some time to come. Because again, there's a balance that needs to be struck, and no one's quite sure where that balance is yet. But I think it's a valuable conversation. We certainly need to diversify, the funding that we're putting into conservation in this country. Other conversations that are happening is with regard to the Land and Water Conservation Fund, which takes a portion of revenues the federal government gets from oil and gas exploration and puts them into conservation. One thing that we think needs to happen is those funds can't just be used to acquire more public lands, because the reality is that we can't take care of what we have already. So adding more acres to the ledger is something that has to be pursued with a great degree of care. What would be great is if we could use these LWCF funds to alleviate some of the maintenance backlogs that we have on our existing public lands, and that's something that we would certainly like to see. And then I think something that the U.S. Is probably going to have to look at in the coming decades is something that Africa is already well versed in, which is public-private partnerships. How can NGOs, foundations, and even commercial interests, work with government to deliver conservation on lands that are accessible by the public. Now, what form that would take, is still something that I think the United States is discussing. But I look at a 2016 report, from Credit Suisse, which I think said there was an excess of $200 billion in potential conservation impact investment that was sitting on the sidelines. And my immediate thought is like, well, how can the United States tap into some of that impact investment, given the potential of both our public and private lands to provide water, to conserve carbon, to provide all of these conservation benefits that the people of the United States, but also the people of the world are seeking.
Yeah, I find that very often my friends or people that I meet when I'm in the States, for the most part, especially if they're involved in the outdoor recreation community in some way, have a very negative view of private land ownership. I live in a country in the UK, but particularly in Scotland, where it's largely speaking private land ownership, but we have free access to that land, not for extractive purposes. So hunting and fishing, for the most part, is still kept under private ownership, but it is accessible, like over the counter, in a very similar way to you would buy permits over the counter. But we have a sort of the equivalent of a guide system here from most private estates. But if you want to mountain bike or kayak or hill walk or camp or or rock climb, most of the other outdoor activities that people want to partake in, you can do that across almost all private land here in Scotland. And the government does help incentivize private land owners to spend money with government help in ways that are in the public interest. So, for example, through regenerating and planting native woodlands, for example. And I think that there is lessons to be learned on both sides of the water and from other parts of the world about how those partnerships and incentives can be placed for the greater good.
I completely agree. And in fact, one thing that I'm endeavoring to do as part of my work is, create a knowledge exchange between Americans and Africans in particular. But I also think the United States has a great deal to learn from Europe, with regard to conservation. My own personal perspective is that a lot of our conservation systems and a lot of our conservation attitudes, are really sort of echoes of a previous time. When Theodore Roosevelt and John Muir and John James Audubon and Ernest Thomas Seton and Henry David Thoreau and all of these conservation icons were creating, what has become the American conservation movement. The United States was still largely unsettled. It was still, had frontier. It was still wild, to a great extent. In the 21st century, the United States is settled. And I think that we're a lot closer these days to, where people are in Scotland or in Scandinavia, than we are necessarily to where Theodore Roosevelt and John Muir stood, in relation to the degree of our relationship with the land. And for that purpose, I think that there's a lot of lessons that Americans can learn from the European experience about how to deliver conservation. And as you said, there's sort of this antipathy that is, just under the surface, sometimes, on the surface of American conservation, this antipathy to private lands. But, as I mentioned, at the beginning of our conversation, 60% of the United States is in private ownership. It provides absolutely critical habitat for endangered and threatened species, as well as many game species. So we have to make private lands part of our conservation dialogue and part of our conservation system, and realize that private ownership does not equate to ecological degradation. And I think Britain and Europe are prime examples of that. There's somewhat of a mythology that's circulated in the United States that Britain and Europe are these ecological wastelands, because
I know. I've
yeah,
faced this a few times in conversations. It's like, no, I think we have stuff to learn from you guys too, over in the States and other parts of the world, but we do some things which are good.
absolutely. I mean, you've got wolves and bears, in continental Europe. There's a massive ecological, conservation campaign going on in Scotland, that I've been following with regard to beaver and other species.
Yeah, they're on my doorstep right here.
Are they? Are they?
Pretty much. Yeah.
They're really cool creatures. I love watching them build.
It's a very controversial. I mean, it's a very controversial subject, beavers, and one that I haven't actually done a podcast on entirely, and it really deserves it. Part of the controversy here is that the established population of beavers were originally illegally introduced. They had a proper monitored program on the west coast with a fairly small number of beavers, which wasn't particularly successful. I don't think they actually bred, but the illegal reintroduction, and they're pretty sure that they know who did it. It's like this open secret. This illegal reintroduction is the one that has been now allowed to proliferate and has protective status. And there's, I think one of the issues with that in terms of Scotland is that they did that without really having mitigation measures in place with a long-term view as to, okay, well, if we accept that this is good and there's lots of positive benefits from it, at what point can we take control measures to prevent it being negative in some instances, and affecting other native wildlife that still exists and hasn't had to be reintroduced? Like, for example, I mean, one of the things that gets brought up is Atlantic salmon, which are struggling globally. Their populations have declined massively. And how will the damming of small tributaries, for example, affect their ability to spawn? It's a complex web of considerations.
And it's the question of how do you find that balance between
Yep.
the landowner, the fishing interests, the people who want to see the wetland benefits provided by the beavers. Many of these challenges, other countries have been there before, other populations have been there before, and I think having a greater exchange between conservationists around the world, is really critical going forward. There's a lot we can learn from each other. And similarly from Africa. I mean, I look at programs like the ones being done by Africa Parks, in African national parks, and I look at the maintenance backlog in our national parks here in the United States, and I think, like, well, what lessons are there here? In terms of using public-private partnerships to take over, the management of struggling assets and turn them around, so that the public can benefit from that.
Maybe if we turn our attention to wildlife trade, because I know that will take us into a conversation in Africa in particular. But if we talk about wildlife trade with the current issues that we're facing around the world with the coronavirus pandemic, and the conversations have been, well, to stop this happening again, we need to ban the trade of wildlife. This is the sort of the very basic and oversimplistic captions that have been floating around the internet. I think it would be really useful if you could give listeners sort of an overview of what is the global wildlife trade. Because when most people hear of that, they think of the illegal trade. That's the first thing that comes to mind. They think of the illegal trade, or they think of the trade for trophy animals, trophy hunting. And the reason why they think of that is because it has been so topical, both in the UK and the United States, for the last 2 to 3 years, or basically since Cecil the Lion. So what do we mean when we're talking about wildlife trade, and what is the connection with that and the conversations with COVID-19 and future pandemics?
Yeah, so the wildlife trade, as you allude to, is a massive, massive enterprise. It ranges everything from the selling of hunted game meat in marketplaces around the world, That can be the selling of game meat in places in Africa, places in Asia, but also it can be the selling of game meat, at a butcher shop in Oxford or some other, British or European city. The selling of grouse, the selling of pheasants. Um, it can include the sale of animals for the pet trade. It can include the sale of animal skins to make drums, or other leather goods. It can include, the trophy hunting trade, that you mentioned, and which I expect we'll talk more about in a couple of minutes. And then, of course, there's the illicit trade in commodities like elephant ivory, rhino horn, both live pangolin and pangolin scales. So it's a massive, enterprise that spans, the entire world and countless numbers of species, and it's regulated, at least in the international sphere, under the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species. But that convention does not regulate trade within countries. It only regulates trade between countries. And of course, the illicit trade, it doesn't regulate, at all, because it's an illicit trade and therefore not regulated by treaty or any other type of legal mechanism. And you know, when the COVID-19 pandemic emerged, the initial narrative that came out of Wuhan, China, was that the outbreak had been traced to a fresh food market in the city of Wuhan, and blame was initially placed on the sale of wildlife in the market. And my understanding is that was a result of the fact that the cluster of cases that they identified in the market was from the part of the market where wildlife was being sold. Um, but since that initial announcement, was made by the Chinese government, more research on this disease has occurred. And what they found is a couple of things. One, the person that they believe to be patient zero was actually came down with the disease in November, and most importantly, that person had no contact whatsoever with the Wuhan market. Um, so it's hard to say that it emerged in the Wuhan market. I think what really happened was the market was an amplifier. There was um, one person who knows much more about infectious disease than I do, who said the virus came into that market before it walked out of that market. Yeah. Um, that there's been suspicion that the pangolin, which is illegal for consumption in China, but the scales can be used for traditional Chinese medicine, might have been, one of the might have been the animal from which the disease jumped into a human host. But there's no sign that pangolin was sold at the Wuhan market, so that further deepens the mystery. I could go on about this at length. In fact, I just published a piece for PERC, covering it.
Yeah, I'll link it in the show notes.
But the short story is we don't know at this point, where this disease exactly emerged from, and what, if any, links to wildlife trade might be. That's still a big mystery. And given that, the trade in wildlife provides food security, economic security, and, most importantly, incentivizes the conservation of large areas of habitat, which, a growing chorus of experts is saying is necessary to do in order to prevent the next pandemic from spilling over into humanity. Um, these calls for blanket bans on wildlife trade seem to me to be a little bit misplaced. It's a little bit like conducting brain surgery with a sledgehammer. Um, what we really need to do is take a targeted and equitable approach to how we address, the intersection of wildlife trade and the risk of pandemic disease, and focus on those species that are most likely to transmit disease, and focus a lot less on things like the importation of hunting trophies, since there has
Because it
been.
takes up a lot. It takes up a lot of time. It takes up a lot of political time. It takes up a lot of space, and it really is not. It shouldn't be of the most major and persistent concern, because it's quite simply not if you're worried about the conservation of ecosystems and species.
Exactly. There's no documented cases of somebody getting sick because of a legally imported hunting trophy. So while legislators are discussing, banning those imports in the name of public health, like you said, it takes up a lot of time that would be better spent on focusing on what the real threats are. In fact, I just testified last week in the California Senate on a bill that would ban hunting trophies in the name of public health, and it's
In
not the right
California.
in California. Um, it's just not the right course to go down, especially when we consider again that, hunting in Africa is conserving a massive, massive amount of habitat. And it's doing it in a way that's not dependent on foreign aid or donor funding. Um, for scale, we're talking about an area, more than 2 times the size of the U.S. national park system. So if the experts are saying, we need to conserve habitat in order to prevent viral spillover, it seems like we want to be amplifying the impacts of the trophy hunting industry, not making it more difficult for them to operate by imposing frivolous import bans.
I want to unpack a couple of things that you've just talked about with regard to poverty and in using wildlife as a way of stopping people interacting with wildlife in a way by the sort of sprawl through wild areas. But just to pick up on what happened, just for people who are not aware, what is it that just happened in California, and what's been the outcome of that?
Sure. So the California Senate or I should say the California legislature had previously passed legislation, the iconic African Species Protection Act. And what this bill, would do is ban the import and possession of some pretty common African hunting trophies: zebra, elephant, um, a number of other species. And the legislation had passed the California legislature, and it was vetoed by California's governor at the time, for a number of reasons, primarily relating to the relationship between state law and federal law. My understanding is that the governor felt that the state law conflicted with federal law and therefore would be ruled, unconstitutional. So why waste state resources on adopting laws that will fail in the courts anyway? Um, but with the COVID-19 outbreak, this legislation has come back up for consideration, with proponents saying that it's necessary in order to safeguard public health. But again, we've never seen legally imported, processed shoulder mounts of hunting trophies be a source of disease in the United States. So it's a bit of a frivolous and somewhat disingenuous exercise, to be focusing on hunting trophies as opposed to species that might present a legitimate public health risk to Americans and people around the world.
So, has my understanding of the legislative process in North America is not particularly up to scratch. So, is there another phase after this, or is what stops that actually being passed now?
Right. So I had testified in a committee hearing, the Committee on Natural Resources and Water, and the committee voted to adopt the legislation and move it on to the full Senate for consideration. Um, we'll see if the full Senate, decides to take up the bill. That seems to be an unknown at this point. I know that a number of legislators in California have expressed similar reservations that the state is getting out ahead of the federal government on this, and particularly given the massive drain that the pandemic has had on California's budget. Do they really want to be adopting legislation that they're going to have to defend in court, knowing that they'll likely lose?
Just going back to this conversation about a global ban on wildlife trade, why is it the case that this would particularly affect those already facing some of the gravest poverty in the world? Because it seems like this particular aspect of it has just been washed over in the conversation to ban wildlife trade. It's almost a very sort of privileged position to be able to take to suggest that this is possible and it will only have positive consequences.
Right. Well, if we look at African conservation systems, let's just use Zimbabwe and the campfire areas as a case study. Um, hunting creates economic incentives for rural people to conserve habitat. And we know that this habitat conservation is important because previous disease outbreaks, Ebola, Lassa fever, other diseases, were linked to the intrusion into wildlands by logging and other operations. So, in the campfire areas in Zimbabwe, and again, I'm just using this as an example, the communities receive um, revenue from the hunting outfitters that they lease their land to, um, so that the operators can bring in foreign clients to hunt the wildlife there. And I'm greatly simplifying things, and we can dive in deeper if you want. But by receiving that revenue, there's then incentive to conserve those wildlands and keep them intact, keep them wild, minimize the types of large scale intrusions that logging or agriculture can bring into it, and thereby decrease the risk of viral spillover. But I think what's even more important is that because of this revenue sharing, people now have access to a cash economy that they might not otherwise. And what that cash is being used for, in many cases, is the provision of things like basic sanitation. Um, access to clean water, which, as we all know, is critical to being able to do things like washing one's hands. Similarly, we've seen, these hunting revenues go into constructing rural medical clinics, which not only have the potential to provide immediate medical care to people in rural areas, but should a viral spillover occur, should an outbreak occur, that's going to be the world's early warning system that something has happened, and that everyone else needs to, get prepared for the possibility that the disease has not been contained. So, if we take hunting, out of the equation, we're going to, one, immediately disincentivize the conservation of an area of habitat that's about 2+ times the size of the U.S. national park system. But we're also going to make it much more difficult to create the kind of infrastructure that we need in rural areas, in these places where viruses are known to be hiding, the kind of infrastructure that can serve as that early warning system, for the world, and also, improve public health and create the means by which people can keep themselves healthy, through things like basic sanitation.
It's an interesting conversation to be having in this context framed by a global pandemic, because that is not the conclusion that most people would jump to when they think of conservation in Africa, because this very notion of hunting, or trophy hunting as it's normally referred to, of any kind of hunting that goes on in Africa, is something. There's a gut feeling from the general public, and certainly the way that it's portrayed in the media, that it's an aspect of society that should be shut down and finished kind of once and for all. And we should find a way to, I was going to say we should find a way to replace it with something else of equal or greater economic incentive. But actually, I think most of the conversations are not even really considering that. They just don't want to see the hunting anymore. And the argument always is that there are other alternatives and there are better ways that we can conserve this land. What do you see as the truth of that matter? Is hunting in the continent of Africa a vital tool for conservation, or could we quite easily find another mechanism for it?
It's an important question. And, what I would say is that the conservation benefits of hunting are as well established as the reality that climate change is occurring. I think at this point to say that trophy hunting provides no conservation value is very much akin to saying that climate change is not real. Um, the science is there, the experience is there, the observations are there. That is a settled question. Now, the moral question around trophy hunting is unsettled, and it's not one that I'm going to jump into, because it's not my place to impose my morality on someone else. Um, but what I find interesting about this dialogue is that people will say, well, there's alternatives out there, and phototourism is the one that people point to more often than not. And and there's some truth to that. Phototourism does have a role to play in delivering conservation in Africa. And the way I've always, seen it is that phototourism and trophy hunting are inseparable partners in delivering conservation in Africa. But phototourism isn't going to work everywhere. There's been studies that have shown that only about 1/3 of Botswana's wildlife estate is economically viable, for phototourism. There's been other studies coming out of Namibia showing that if you removed trophy hunting from the communal conservancies and relied strictly on phototourism, the overwhelming majority of those conservancies would no longer be economically viable, and therefore would become at increased risk for development. So phototourism and trophy hunting are not interchangeable, which is why I always say that they're inseparable partners in delivering conservation in Africa. Now, the reason that they're not interchangeable is that phototourists tend to like a certain kind of area by and large, someplace that's closer to airports, has decent infrastructure, not a lot of bush, so that it's actually easier to take photographs. And that are relatively safe and stable and secure. Um, where trophy hunting is occurring are typically your more remote areas. They don't have the same types of density of wildlife that you might find in, say, a national park, where phototourism is occurring, and they certainly don't have the level of infrastructure that places like national parks have in terms of improved roads, hotels, what have you. And I don't think we want to have that level of infrastructure in a lot of these places, because of the aforementioned viral spillover risk that might bring, with the large scale development. I think what gets lost in this conversation too is that the needs are immediate. Um, you need to be able to put cash on the table right now if you want to replace trophy hunting. And while there might be other alternatives out there in theory, nobody stepped up to put cash on the table to execute on those alternatives. I know in some of the recent hunting block auctions in Tanzania, some of the blocks went unsold.
Yeah, I saw that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so the question is, well, why didn't people step up, with cash to execute on some of these alternatives that campaigners, and activists have been promoting? And I think there's a
It's a
lot of
great question.
yeah, I think there's a lot of reasons why they probably didn't, but I think one of them is that at least for the people who are looking at this from more of a market side, the numbers just don't work, right? It's not something that you're going to be able to break even on or generate a return on. Um, so you know, I appreciate that some people have a moral problem with trophy hunting, but my own personal thoughts are, well, what's the greater moral liability? We know that where lion hunting ends, sometimes we see 100 lions killed as opposed to one or two. And if our goal is conservation, which happens at the population level, not at the individual level, um, this is something that has provided immense value to the African continent, to African wildlife, to African people. And alternatives might be out there, but they have yet to prove their viability in the way that trophy hunting has.
Yeah, it's interesting. You're echoing a lot. I had a conversation with Amy Dickman 2-3 weeks ago. It's a podcast that isn't out just yet as I sit and record this with you. And you're echoing a lot of what she was saying with the current state of what's happening in Tanzania with blocks going unsold. And she was saying that the scientists on the ground there are already seeing the negative effects in these what were previous concession blocks with deforestation and increased poaching, because the local communities around these areas now have no other way to get by in their day than to use the resources that are on their doorstep, because there is no other mechanism for them. And they're a long way from all the towns and cities and any kind of government help that might be available, if it's indeed available at all. Replacing it with something which really works for the people who live there is so important. And this kind of brings me to another question and criticism that gets flagged up a lot, is that the hunting outfits and concessions that exist throughout the continent, do they really benefit local people? And I mean, it's not. It would be very obvious if you were to line up all of the vast majority, I would imagine, of concession holders and private landowners, and they would largely be white individuals, not indigenous population. So how does that interaction work in terms of real benefits to the people on the ground there?
Right, and I think that's a key question going forward. You're absolutely right. About the makeup of the backgrounds, within the industry. But I also see that this is an industry that's changing. More and more Black Africans are participating in this industry, as professional hunters and as operators. I've met some of them.
Yeah, I have as well. Yeah.
And I think that's a positive development, and I think it's something that should certainly be encouraged, and I think it will benefit the industry and the countries in which it's operating immensely. Um, in terms of the community benefits that are provided, I think that it's while there are challenges, there's always going to be challenges. No system is completely perfect. Um, and in many places, despite the existence of those challenges, you're going to find that most of the communities would still rather have the income that's coming from trophy hunting than nothing at all. Has made their lives better. Going back to the campfire areas in Zimbabwe, I think
it was a very effective. It was a very effective system, the campfire model. It often gets held up as one of the great examples.
Yeah, and I think this was USAID data that I'm citing, but I might be mistaken about that. I think they found that household incomes increased 25%, because of the presence of trophy hunting in the communal areas. And I think we have to look at the second and third order effects, as well. We were talking about Tanzania and how the fact that hunting blocks have gone unsold is leading to those lands being cleared. And we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that last year, the World Bank warned Tanzania that the ecological degradation that it was witnessing in those hunting blocks, but beyond, threatened the country's long-term potential for economic development. And that gets us back to the disease question. There is a clear and compelling link between poverty and disease. And if we're undermining, the ability of countries to lift themselves out of poverty, we're just making it much easier for the next pandemic to emerge. So we really need to be engaging, with every tool that we can, in the conservation realm to lift people out of poverty, at any degree possible. And I think it's important to know why those hunting blocks have gone unsold, and U.S. regulations have been a big factor in the reason that those hunting blocks were left vacant. In 2014, the U.S. imposed a moratorium on the importation of elephant trophies from Tanzania. Similarly, Endangered Species Act restrictions have limited the ability to import lions from Tanzania into the United States. And this is problematic because, elephant and lion hunts subsidized a lot of the hunting operations in Tanzania. And once you removed them from the equation, those operations quickly became economically unviable. So there's no reason to hold on to hunting blocks and to continue to steward that habitat and put anti-poaching resources on the ground. If you're not going to be making money in your enterprise. And as we said a few minutes ago, no one's stepping up and putting cash on the table with any other alternative. So those immediate needs are going to be met, and those immediate needs are going to be met by clearing that land.
Yeah, it's a strange paradox, because here we have, if we're looking at Tanzania as an example, here we have a country which I think in Africa has one of the highest densities of lions on the continent. It is a democratic country, as far as I can tell. In fact, fairly stable by comparison to some other African countries which have had issues in recent years and historically over decades. And the government there makes the decision that they want to lease these vast areas as hunting concessions, where people can bid for them, and the money goes to government, which then is used to run the country. And yet we have a situation here where they are basically being curtailed to do what they want to do with their land by external legislation.
That's exactly right. The International Fund for Animal Welfare has reported that the United States makes up about 70% of the global trophy hunting market. So that makes, the United States, incredibly important, within that industry. And being able to access the U.S. market is really key. Some might argue essential for, these operations to survive. So legislation and regulation in the United States, has sends a shockwave across the Atlantic and across the African continent in terms of its ability to influence land use in African nations, particularly when you start, getting at those keystone components, of the industry that is subsidizing their ability to do what they do in terms of habitat stewardship and anti-poaching. It's interesting, and one thing I've tried to personally do, in my work is to get policymakers here in the States to view this issue not only in terms of conservation and in terms of economic development, but also the relationships that we have, with these African partner nations. Because I'm not certain that has been until recently, a full appreciation of what it really means, to these countries when you take these regulatory and legislative steps, and how that can impact the relationship between our two countries.
And that's not just true of North America. I mean, we're in the process of discussing very similar legislation to what you've already imposed there. But it appears to me like how it comes across is inadvertent sanctions on these countries. I mean, that's essentially what the United States has done. It's what Britain's about to do, and many other European countries are doing. And these sanctions on their ability to trade are not based on trying to incentivize them to do a better job at protecting their species and ecosystems and overall conservation. Because if you look at Botswana as an example, or Tanzania, particularly when it comes to lions, but if you were to look at vast areas that are remaining fairly intact in terms of sort of wildlife corridors and are not being developed, it's a brilliant example of that. So these countries are doing exactly what we want them to do, but we're now trying to tell them that they can't continue doing it the way that they've done it, but without providing a solution.
I think that it's, a perfect explanation of what we see happening. And it's interesting that you use the term sanctions. That's one that I've used before, myself. I've referred to some of them as de facto sanctions. And I think it's an interesting framework at which to look at these things because, sanctions are obviously a coercive tool that governments use in order to create pressure towards a certain kind of outcome.
Yeah.
And it's not clear what outcome is being sought here, except stop doing this, we don't like it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's not based on science, that's for sure.
No, it's not based on science, and it's not saying, stop doing this, do this instead. Um,
No.
it's 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 a very sticky situation in many ways, and I think it's because the conversation is being dominated, by sort of this very surface understanding of hunting in Africa and what it actually involves and what it actually provides, and how it serves as a very sustainable, self-sustaining way for African countries to achieve many of the goals that the United Kingdom, the European Union, and the United States share with their African partner nations. But we're stuck in this very surface level conversation, and it's not necessarily a productive conversation as long as we stay, within this superficial sphere. One thing that I've noticed people are always surprised by is, when I tell them, it's not like people go over there, shoot an animal, cut off its head, and leave the carcass to rot. Those animals get eaten, just as they're, more often than not eaten in the United States and in the UK and Europe. But I think for a lot of, our fellow countrymen, that they have trouble conceptualizing that people would eat elephant or eat giraffe or,
Both taste
any
very good.
number of other species. It does, what I always tell people is, just like we eat elk and deer, um, that they eat the game that they have available to them. But it's because of this, you know, perception, that's been created, that these animals are not food. That I think, people have a very misinformed perception of what hunting in Africa actually entails.
To finish up, I want to ask you about what the current pandemic has shown us about the fragility of conservation in Africa. But before we get to that, as a kind of close, I wanted to pick up on, and I asked this question based on an article which you wrote for PERC. I think the title was Zero Sum Game for Wildlife, and you were looking at this sort of protectionist model, particularly that they have in Kenya, and how it's been failing. Can you tell me a little bit about that? Because we see some of it in pockets around Europe and as parts of the conversation, particularly with the phrase of rewilding here, which is this notion that we should really just leave it be. And this comes up quite a lot in podcast conversations that I have, where there are certain parts of society that want to remove our sort of influence as humans on the landscape and believe that that is the best outcome. And I can very much understand where that thinking comes from, but my response always is that we have reshaped the landscape around the world so much now that it has actually become our responsibility to take a hands-on proactive approach in order to achieve the best outcomes that we want. And part of that is actually trying to decide what are those outcomes that we really want. So what is the zero-sum game for wildlife? And maybe it would be a good idea just to have a slight bit of background story as to what's actually happened in Kenya, particularly with the migration corridors.
Sure. I think this idea of leave it be is an interesting one. I think it's very romantic as well. I struggle to see how in a world of, billions and billions of people, um, which has already happened and is going to continue to happen for the foreseeable future, um, we're going to just be able to leave it be. Um, I also think there's the reality that not only have we altered the landscape, we've been altering the landscape for our entire history as a species. We've been shaping and reshaping landscapes for tens of thousands of years, and to pick some arbitrary point in the timeline and say we should keep it that way is something that I sort of struggle with, because there is hardly a place, in this world that has not been touched by human hands. I mean, even in the depths of the Amazon basin now, they're finding that there, are signs that there was agriculture there a long, long time ago, before it reverted back to forest. So we've been shaping and reshaping landscapes, for our entire history. And I think that the really appropriate question we need to be looking at is, how do we live in a way that's sustainable for ourselves, for our society, and for the creatures with which we share this planet, as opposed to going back to some arbitrary point on the timeline. Now, in Kenya, it's captivated the imagination of a lot of Western conservationists, because in 1977 they banned the consumptive use of wildlife. And they did that for a lot of reasons, and it's not for me to judge whether those reasons are good or bad, but we do know what the impacts of that were. And what we've seen happen since 1977 is the widespread, large-scale decline of many species of wildlife that are otherwise common in other parts of East Africa. Some species, have declined by as much as 60%. Some would say, the declines are even more severe than that. And these declines are occurring outside of the national parks, which form a relatively small percentage of Kenya's land, compared to the communal and private lands that are held in the country. Now, to help alleviate this, the Kenyans recognize that they have this challenge. They've, of course, developed the conservancy system, which is, sort of a corporate structure that communities or individuals or others can engage in, whereby they can co-manage wildlife with the Kenya Wildlife Service. And this is definitely a step in the right direction to helping alleviate some of these wildlife declines. But where they continue to face a challenge, at least as far as I see it, is their options for generating income from wildlife remain very, very limited. Phototourism, is the dominant option where income can be generated from wildlife. And what I've seen in my research is that phototourism is not necessarily competitive in every place with agriculture, be it livestock or crop agriculture. It's not competitive on price. You can go into a conservancy, yes, but the fact remains that you will make more money growing crops or raising cattle than you will bringing in phototourists. And this has been particularly acute down in the Serengeti Mara ecosystem, which is home to the Great Migration, the massive movement of wildebeest, zebra, and gazelle that a lot of people are familiar with from Discovery Channel and BBC and National Geographic and other nature programming. And this migration is beginning to collapse, according to Kenyan researchers and researchers from elsewhere. And it's because the migratory pathways are being converted from open grassland to agriculture. And it's, again, because of the fact that phototourism and the wildlife conservation that it incentivizes isn't actually incentivizing it because it's not competitive on price. So, we're faced with this situation where we have to figure out a way for Kenyan communities and Kenyan landowners to make more money than they do, by keeping the land open instead of converting it to agriculture. And I think one thing that, holds some promise that's being investigated is carbon credits, because you do have these wonderful grasslands, which, can sequester carbon. And bringing that into the mix along with phototourism may push us over that edge where it makes more sense to leave the land out of agriculture and keep it open for wildlife than it does to convert it to row crops or cattle pasture.
So would this be, for people who are not familiar with how that works, is the basic principle you might have a company or business that is contributing negatively in terms of their carbon output, and they offset that by buying carbon credits in another country, which is offsetting it by having either planting forests or maintaining an ecosystem that is already intact. And this revenue stream of money for these areas is what helps pay local people and the people who live there to keep it as it is.
That's exactly how it works. And, again, it's an imperfect system. There's challenges in the system, but there's challenges in every system. Some of the challenges that need to be addressed are like really fundamental things, though, like getting this up to scale will require increasing the transaction capacity of African banks, to handle these kinds of exchanges. But I think that's, something that can have second and third order effects that will benefit African economies on a wider scale, beyond the conservation impacts. And it's things that are worth looking at. But it also requires that conservationists be a little bit more business minded than they have in the past.
I mean, what it really boils down to is something which I don't think is considered anywhere near enough when we talk about conservation, because most of those discussions evolve around research that's being done. It's ecologists and biologists on the ground, and particularly in Africa, there's very often also conversations about anti-poaching measures. But what this really boils down to is the economics. Because if the economics incentivizes a system where we're getting the outcomes that society as a global entity want, then we're going to have positive conservation for ecosystems and local communities and the wildlife that lives and interacts within them. If the economics leans to a side where there is a different alternative, that in the long run, that's the route that it will take, whether that be agriculture or in very rural communities with very little other option or place to turn to. They turn to poaching because very often there isn't another choice.
I think you're absolutely right. There's a tendency among conservationists to be a bit myopic. A lot of the conversations that I'm party to, quite frankly, people look at conservation as if it occurs in a vacuum, as opposed to is something that's pursued within the context of a larger society that has competing goals, competing needs. And, I think if we're going to be successful in the 21st century, it's not just a question of how do we reduce poaching or how do we conserve habitat. It's also a question of how do we provide for what people need, using conservation as the means to deliver that, and thereby, reducing that competition between needs. And, the ability of trophy hunting, for example, to conserve large swaths of habitat, which we know is needed to prevent the risk of viral spillover and pandemic disease, is one example of that. But, there's many others that I'm sure, we could hash out. But, I think we need to start moving away from conservation as a cause, a political cause, a social cause, and instead start looking at it as a tool for how we're going to manage our societies and live sustainably on this planet.
Yeah, I think it also has a very real place in alleviating a lot of the social inequities that exist around the world as well. And I don't think that's discussed enough. When we look at conservation, particularly from the Western world, it is always about preserving these what we view as pristine wildernesses and the wildlife within them. But really, conservation is a story about the interaction between people and wildlife and the land that they share.
Which brings us back to Leopold and his whole discussion of
It
having a
does,
land
yeah,
ethic. Um,
absolutely.
what is our relationship with the landscape? What is our relationship with this planet? And what is our relationship with each other and the creatures with which we share this planet?
Now, just as a way of wrapping this up, because I don't want to keep you much longer, but I think this is a perfect ending to an amazing conversation. One of the and I brought this up on a couple of podcasts. I've posed this question to a few people recently. The current pandemic has really highlighted the fragility of our funding mechanisms in conversation. Now, some in conservation rather, and some of this you've kind of covered already by looking at this, the potential of using carbon credits to protect landscapes. What do you think the situation around the world with this almost immediate halt of travel, which for countries particularly like, let me rephrase that, for continents particularly like Africa, which rely so heavily on tourism, be that photographic or hunting tourism, to fund their conservation models, almost overnight that money has dried up. What do we need to put in place going forward to make sure that if this ever happens again, that they can ride that wave until people can travel again? It seems to me that what it has highlighted is just how fragile the system is, because most of that funding was essentially coming from a single source. It was coming from the ability of people to travel from one side of the planet to the other.
No, absolutely, and that fragility has been laid out, I think, for everyone to see, and it's not just in Africa; it's in the United States as well. I mean, I look at Montana, and Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks in the U.S. gets about twice as much revenue from the sale of out-of-state hunting licenses than it does in-state hunting licenses, and that's a function of everything from low population density in Montana itself, to some other factors. But even in the U.S., agencies are looking at budgetary shortfalls because people are not able to travel. Plus with the economic downturn that's accompanied the pandemic, discretionary income has been reduced. So maybe that safari to Africa is just not on the it's definitely not on the books for this year, but it might not be on the books for next year either. And we've been here before, during one of the more recent Ebola outbreaks. Even though the disease was thousands of miles away in West Africa, safari operators in Kenya and Tanzania saw significant declines in bookings.
That's because people think Africa's a country and not a continent, which was a faux pas on my behalf when I asked you that question.
Exactly. I mean, but that is the perception. It's a country, not a continent, and thanks to a really poor map projection, people think it's much smaller than it actually is.
Yeah.
But that fragility is there, and it is reliant on one source, tourism, be that photo tourism or hunting tourism. And I think what needs to be at the top of the list for those of us who care about Africa is thinking through, like, what are the other revenue streams that we can tap into to fund conservation. But I think in order to do that too, we need to get back to that question of what are the benefits that conservation provides. Conservation has to be more about privileged white Westerners coming to some place to have an experience in nature. It's got to have more meaning than that. It's got to be providing goods and services and be supporting economic growth and development. And if we start thinking about it in those terms, I think we'll quickly start to realize what are some of the other funding sources that can come to the table. Now, we talked about carbon credits as being one potential one. Another thing that I think is really cool that's going on are the water funds that have sprung up around Nairobi and in Cape Town, whereby companies that are heavily dependent on water resources, think Coca-Cola, are investing money in habitat restoration in the watersheds that they're dependent on, because that habitat restoration and conservation will help to ensure the water supply that they need to conduct business. And I think that that's how we need to start thinking about conservation more and more. It's not that we abandon sort of the legacy viewpoints. It's a both and, not an either or. But I think we need to do this quickly, and there's probably going to be a need for some bridge funding, because operators, be they phototourism or hunting, are looking at a lost season this year, and whether or not they'll be able to weather that through 2021 remains to be seen. And there's a lot on the table. I look just at South Africa, where you've got a wildlife estate of 50 million acres of private lands, which is a pretty significant chunk of land that's completely dependent on hunting revenue for its sustainment. And these are former cattle ranches that had been restored to wildlife habitat. And if wildlife habitat is no longer something that can produce income for these landowners, they're probably going to turn to something else, to produce that income. And my guess is that because of the need to meet, immediate necessities, what they turn to won't necessarily be something that will make it easy to get us back to where we were just 6 months ago.
Yeah, there is a lot to think on there. I think this conversation has probably made people ask themselves more questions than it's answered, but it certainly has answered a lot of questions as well. I certainly think there needs to be a reevaluation about what we as a global society view as progress. I think most countries view progress as increasing GDP. That's the bottom line, and that's it. And that can't be the be all and end all. But I think in many cases it is driving economic markets. But deciding what the outcomes that we want and what we wish to reward as a society, I think will define how well we manage to fund conservation going forward. But Catherine, thank you so much for taking the time. It's been a brilliant conversation. Where can people read more? Because I know that you and PERC, you put out a lot of content, a lot of really good content. Where can people go and read up and follow up on some of the conversation that we've had today?
People can find PERC at www.perc.org. So that's perc.org. And at perc.org, you'll find the bulk of our research that's been conducted by myself and my colleagues on a whole range of topics, not just wildlife, but also land use, water, fisheries. We've got a pretty deep bench of researchers, and we've done what I like to believe is some pretty exciting work over the years about how markets and property rights can be leveraged to deliver conservation. So.
And you're on Twitter as well? Because I know you share a lot of stuff.
I'm on Twitter as well at Catherine Semcer.
Great. Well, thank you so much. And I look forward to speaking with you again at some point.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for listening. Tune in next week when we will take another walk into the wilderness.